going on, everybody? It's RoarYJ here, coming at you with a brand new video. Now, I know I just took a little bit of a break last month so I could enjoy my spring break to myself because I was exhausted after pumping out so much content compared to what I'm used to, but we're back in the grind game right now, especially now that we're getting paid for our efforts, so, please watch through the ads. But anyways, it's the beginning of the month, and so you know the drill. It is time for our monthly Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list for whatever month it may be. Currently, we are in April 2022. Now, I think the format is slowly being more and more defined after the sudden insurgence of the pile decks in the format. Especially because we just had a bunch of regionals as well as MBT's Chalice Slime Monthly to go off of. Unfortunately, I couldn't find too much to go off of, especially because MBT deleted his top 16 photo, which really makes me angry because I had it in my likes thinking that I could get to it later. I'm not used to his whole Chalice Slime Monthly thing, but I can kind of vaguely remember what it was all in the top 16. But I will be using that as well as some of the deck lists and stuff, the topping deck lists that I found for some of the regionals on YouTube in order to help me compile some of the research here. However, I will also be going off of personal opinion as well as the opinion of other people online, especially in the Yu-Gi tubing and Yu-Gi-Oh content creator sphere, and other research such as that. So with that in mind, please be sure not to attack me, anyone in my comments, or other creators in their comment sections, as it's completely unnecessary and really just pointless, and also, if you do, you get no bitches. But yeah, I don't want to ramble on for too long, so let's go ahead and get right into my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh tier list for the April 2022 format. So you may notice that our tier list is a bit different this time, and instead of having a tier 1, we have a meta-changing slot, and that is because I personally believe that the very top decks have such a high power disparity compared to the other top decks. So I figured I will basically be putting the high tier 1.5s and the lower tier 1s in the 1.5 category, while having everything that's above and beyond up in the meta-changing category. It's not going to be too much different, however, just know that there's a bit of a power disparity in terms of what is better than some of the other things. But regardless, let's go ahead and get right into our first deck, and I know this is a really weird symbol, but this is Pile. You like that? I think it's kind of cute. I searched for like the perfect Pile picture for this, but this is Pile, also known as Based. I think also it's known as Kitchen Sink. Sink spelled isn't like synchro, which I think is really funny. And this is going to be immediately in our meta-changing tier, because this deck is crazy. Honestly, so all the deck lists I've seen, especially the topping ones, because Based actually did win the Lubbock Regional, I believe, over the last weekend as of recording this, and it's absolutely just ridiculous. It's basically just good stuff with the deck, where you take as many good engines and hand traps as possible, and you cram them all into a 60-card deck, and you just work with it, right? And you'll notice that's a common theme throughout some of the things we are going to be looking at as well in our tier list. It's not just this deck. However, this is basically going off the standard one, where it's just all the good stuff engines. You have the Scythe Lock with the DPE, you have the Halt combo with the Punk stuff, you have the Adventurer stuff, you have a bunch of hand traps, you have, I'm trying to think of the other engine. I know there's one more, right? Is there another engine? I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm like really out of it right now. But basically, it's just a bunch of different really top tier engines being slammed together in a really ridiculous combo deck. And overall, I think it's kind of not great for the format, but feel free to tell me your opinions in the comments below. Just remember not to be rude, by the way, as I will not tolerate that. But I personally think this deck is completely ridiculous and is setting the bar really high for what grants a deck being a top deck or not, as well as deck building this format. Because last format, you may remember, we were in a very board breaker heavy format. Things like Dark Ruler, Lightning Storm, Forbidden Droplet, and eventually Regeki as soon as the ban list dropped. Because we were still in that format for just a little bit longer. But now we have moved into a very hand trap heavy format, as a lot of the decks are playing these sort of one-card combos that lead into the Hulk stuff, the Griffin Rider, the DPE, and so you need a bunch of different hand traps to counter all of that, especially things like Ghost Ogre and with E-Telly. And so decks are basically playing anywhere from like 18 plus hand traps, which is ridiculous. And this deck is able to play like 20 if it really feels like it, because the rest of the 40 cards can just be their engine pieces, which is very silly in my opinion. But all that out of the way, remember this does set the bar for sort of what the deck building is going to look like for some of the decks on this tier list, and it is going to be our very top deck for this current format. So next up we have Dinosaur, of course. We usually always start with Dinosaur unless we have something that needs to immediately be addressed, such as Pile in this instance, because Dinosaur is obviously a fan favorite on our channel, and I'm going to have to keep Dinosaur and Rogue. So Dinosaur was already not in the greatest spot, especially with Lancia running around everywhere, and while Lancia isn't being run as much as it was, even though it is still seeing a good amount of play, basically the Halt combo that you can usually do off of one card, being like E-Telly, right? It ends on an Arc Light if they want to. and Arclight tells Misk to get the fuck back in his corner. Basically, it's going to be very hard for Dino players to actually thrive, especially since we're in a more hand trap heavy and less board breaking format, so even going second Dino, which is a classic in case the deck is doing very poorly going first, isn't the best option, even though they do have 3 Regeki, which is a bit unfortunate. However, it is a bit understandable, especially considering that they're probably also going to be ending off on hand traps anyway, so even if you open the Dark Ruler, and definitely not the Droplet, because if you're playing Droplet in Dinosaur, you're a madman, but even if you have the Dark Ruler, they're probably just going to have like 3 hand traps in their hand, and they're going to be perfectly fine, because a single hand trap can basically make this deck explode. And so Dinosaur, while I do love you, and while Tyranno is one of the most kick-ass boss monsters to ever exist, I feel like right now it's just not in that great of a spot. Next up, we have Dogmatika invoke Shaddoll, and admittedly, this deck hasn't been doing very much, at least not that I could really see. I think it did get a top 8 spot at one of the regionals. However, I don't really think that matters too much in the grand scheme of things, and so I'm going to be putting it at the very top of tier 2. Remember that the very top of tier 2 is sort of like the lower 1.5 for this list, so don't really take it too personally for playing Dogmatika invoke Shaddoll. I still think the deck is great, especially because we are going to be getting the branded structure deck, or the Albaz strike structure deck, in April, which is why we have a different deck coming up next that I will discuss. And I believe, personally, that the Invoke Dogmatika Shaddoll build, or even just an Invoke Shaddoll build, is the best build to utilize things like Branded Fusion. I feel like that card is going to be very, very good for the deck, even though you don't really want to search it too much, because you'd rather normal summon Alistair than Kit or Aluber. So you're basically just going to be hard drawing the Branded Fusion, but if you do, that's just absolutely ridiculous, because it's so much free advantage. Or it can even bait hand traps in case you need to have something like your Magical Meltdown go off. I think the deck is still in a pretty good spot. However, in terms of the amount of interruptions it puts up compared to the current top decks right now, it really just can't keep up in terms of power, despite having some pretty nifty follow-up overall. So while consistency is very, very good, and this deck has a lot of it, even with the Nadir Servant hit to 2 ban lists ago, I feel like it just can't really keep up with the current top decks, at least in this very specific format, because things are getting a bit too out of hand. Next up, we have Despia, and I'm actually, compared to what everyone else is saying, I'm gonna put Despia under Invoked in tier 2. I don't really feel like Despia is that great. Even with the Branded Fusion, keep in mind that the deck is basically being carried by the Branded Fusion at that point, when you really think about it, because its end board otherwise is like Ad Libitum, Masquerade, and maybe like 1 or 2 back row that likes quick fuses or quick specials or something if they don't open Super Poly. I think Despia overall is a very underwhelming archetype in terms of what it does, especially when paired with the Branded Fusion, when so many other decks could run Branded Fusion. So we aren't currently there yet. We do have a month away to get there, but I think that Predaplank out of Dimension Force is going to be a lot better than Despia, including using the Branded Fusion package if they so choose to play it, because Despia overall is a bit too slow for me. Masquerade is a very great boss monster, though, I will definitely admit that. I think it's going to be a great Super Poly target for a lot of people, because we are going to go into a bit of a Super Poly side deck staple format because of this kind of stuff. But I think despite it doing super well over in the OCG, I don't think it's going to do all too much over here, because we have to keep in mind that the OCG format is completely different than ours, considering, you know, the chess clock for their turns, the max C at 3, and the fact that they're overall in more of a control format, which decks like this, of course, thrive in. And so, while I do think it's going to be pretty good, I do think the Invoked build is going to be a lot stronger, and I do think that it's not going to be able to keep up, at least for now, unless Super Poly becomes a very good board breaker. We'll just have to see, though, honestly, because this is just my personal opinion, remember that, so do not be, you know, too condescending when you destroy me in the comments, or when you come to prove me wrong, like, half a month from now. But until we actually see this in, like, a really high-tier event in action, I don't think it's going to be, too easy for me to place it up high, because that's happened to me multiple times where I hype a deck up, and then it ends up disappointing everybody, I'm sorry. Anyways, next we have Ad Ignister, and I'm going to have to put Ad Ignister under the Rogue category. Once again, like I always usually say, Ad Ignister is a very interesting deck. I think it's very cool, especially being able to turbo out a potentially 6k towers, and being able to turbo out access code really easily compared to some other decks. I feel like it just doesn't do enough, especially considering that, you know, if people are really scared of it, they'll just play Kaijus or Boral Sword or something like that if it was a threat. But the thing is, the deck really does not like hand traps, particularly on Dark Templar, be it a Ogre, Ghost Bell, Imperm, Veiler, Ghost Mourner even. I really feel like the deck just suffers too much, especially in a format like this, because we are running so many hand traps in our decks, and so one or two perfectly placed hand traps, or even just remotely well-placed hand traps against this deck, will completely shut it down, and its end board will be very lackluster without its towers. Even then, the towers, while it's pretty good, isn't the best monster you could play, and a lot of monsters can really just beat over it, to be fair. So at Ignister, I really do hope that you get better, like, support in the future and more relevance, but currently it is not in a very good spot. So next up we have Sword Soul, specifically Tenyi Sword Soul, which is also involving Hulk, but it's also including the Tenyi pile decks. And because of this, I'm going to be putting it as our second meta-changing deck. And while this does mainly go for the fact that you can play it really well on a pile, which is admittedly only a couple of Sword Soul cards and more Tenyi stuff than anything, and just a bunch of good stuff engines for the base build, I do feel like even regular Tenyi Sword Soul, especially with the Hulk build, is very, very strong compared to some of the other decks. Speaking of which, if you do want to see a Tenyi Sword Soul build without Hulk at first, we will be getting to a Hulk build eventually, but instead using a Mare build with Tenyi Spirit Sarasara, go ahead and click the link up in the top right-hand corner, the annotation. I will have a deck profile with good friend of the channel, M-Rocket. He's showcasing his amazing Tenyi Sword Soul deck profile that he managed to get first place at our locals with and got a really killer live twin mat. But yeah, I think the deck is very strong no matter what build you're playing, as long as you're not playing like pure, I guess. Especially because you can also play the Punk variant, which helps you turbo out the Hulk better. You can also play a Virtual World variant if you really want to, which I don't think is the best variant, but I think it's better than pure. You can play, of course, the regular Tenyi variant, which just utilizes the Sword Soul and Tenyi cards as two separate engines without Hulk. You can also run the Mare stuff, like I said, up in the corner. You can go check that out. And of course, you can run the base stuff, which ends off on a typical based end board, as well as something like maybe Cheng Ying or Chi Xiao, or having a bunch of Tenyis in the grave for a little bit of a turbo boost for your engine, which especially works well with Adventure Token, by the way. I think the deck is very, very solid. Ever since its inception from Burst of Destiny, it's been a very good deck, and it's actually one of the only decks we've hyped up a lot that has lived up to its potential. Actually, I think people were actually saying Sword Soul wasn't that great at first compared to something like Flunder, which, how wrong we were, but yeah, I think Sword Soul deserves its spot on the meta-changing part of our tier list, and so without further ado, let's go ahead and get on to the next one. Next up, we have Altergeist, and Altergeist, I'm sort of torn between putting it above or below at Ignister, because Altergeist isn't a bad deck per se. It did just get the new support back in December, but admittedly that support, as I've said in the past few tier lists, hasn't really done enough for Altergeist to actually see like any sort of relevance. People were too complicated with their reasonings on why to run 1, 2, or 3 Pukuri, and Memory Gant, while it's a pretty good card, isn't the best game ender compared to something like Access Code, right? And so Altergeist is stuck in this sort of limbo where it's like, it's just really not good anymore. It's a bit power crept compared to a lot of other trap decks you could play, especially in the upcoming, probably more trap-heavy format we're going to be reaching come this June or July. I believe it's July, yeah, that we're getting Tactical Masters, and it really just can't keep up very well, so admittedly, it can probably play through hand traps a bit better because you can fall back on purple cards compared to Ignister, so I will put it just slightly above, but I'm being very generous with that, because admittedly, it can run things like Secret Village still, but they did lose Imperial Order in the last ban list, so it was very painful for them as it was a very, very good card for them to run. However, they do still have Anti-Spell, of course, and Secret Village. They also have Protocol, being able to stop responses to the Altergeist cards. It's really good against all of the hand traps currently running around. And of course, Soquidus is always still really, really funny to run. While it's not the best trap deck you could play, it is very, unique in the terms of its playstyle, being able to revolve more around the monsters and the traps rather than just the traps compared to a lot of other trap decks. It's also a very good deck for you or your friend to get into either a budget competitive format or into playing Control as a strategy, because it's very simplistic in terms of its playstyle, but not too simplistic that you won't understand how you're supposed to do your chains properly. So I will be putting Altergeist just above Ignister. I think it's a bit generous to do that. However, I am a bit biased. I think the deck is pretty neat, even though it is a bit annoying, and it's gained a bit of a reputation, but that's where it's going to go for now. Next up, we have Madolche, and I think I'm going to put Madolche below Dinosaur just a smidgen. So Madolche, of course, did really well at first when we came back to live events, winning the first regional that happened, and then completely disappeared off the face of the earth, right? It was a little bit after Crossout came out, if I recall correctly, but to be honest, considering how hard Madolche dies to hand traps, and the fact that we're running like anywhere from 18 plus in our decks right now, no amount of crossout designators or called buys can really save you when you're playing Madolche. They do have one-card combos, however, they are a bit clunky compared to a lot of other decks that do have one-card combos as well. And so there's really no incentive to play Madolche over any of those decks, as well as considering the fact that you have to play so many hand traps and crossouts just to get around your opponent's hand traps in order to do any sort of plays to end on a relatively lackluster board. Don't get me wrong, Glass Souffle is still pretty good, and Tiramisu is still some of the best removal, if not the best removal in the entire game, but the deck still overall just suffers from bricking with really bad hands over and over, even with something like Small World to help it out, as well as just dying super hard to anything more than one hand trap, even with a good hand. And so I'm going to be keeping Madolche here in the rogue category. It does suck because I do enjoy the deck. I think it'd be great if it saw a bit more competitive success, but for now, that's where it's going to go. Next up, we have Drytron, and Drytron's still been doing relatively well lately. I think it did steal a top slot in the Chalice Line Monthly, if I recall correctly. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any topping regional spots because no one's uploading to YouTube, which has been annoying. Well, would you look at that? Believe it or not, I actually just checked MCool's channel, and I saw a little bit of a breakdown for this Indianapolis regional, which was the bigger one compared to all the other ones that happened. That's actually a bit helpful, thank you. But yeah, so Drytron actually is in a pretty decent spot right now. Admittedly, it did lose its powerhouse in the form of Eva being able to get you your Herald negates, and Ben 10 is still limited after all, and so it is unable to really go for the Herald plays anymore. However, it is still really, really good in the fact that Megalith Drytron is really good. If you want to see a relatively baseline Megalith Drytron build, you can go ahead and check out the annotation again. We have our good friend Chris actually back on the channel for that. It's not the best deck list, however, it is still pretty solid. And the power that lies within Megalith Drytron is the fact that it's a little bit more consistent, in my opinion, than the Fairy Drytron build, as you can actually use the Megaliths in case you draw a bad hand in order to sort of try and power through and get more to your combo pieces with things like Ock being able to draw. But basically, you get to end on boards like Scythe Lock with DPE, Draconids. You can search Scythe, by the way, which is hilarious. And then, of course, the Megalith Bethor being able to pop for anywhere up to 4 to 5 cards on your opponent's turn, which is a very strong effect. So while Drytron may not be the powerhouse that it used to be, I think it's still in a very good spot in terms of competitive relevance right now, as it's very easy to pick up in my opinion compared to some of the other combo decks, even though it does require a little bit of skill in actually, using which Drytron effect when. But I think it's a great pick, especially because it is slowly starting to get more budget, especially because you don't even need something like Diviner of the Herald unless you go into something like Baronet or maybe even Beatrice, because you can always just play Manju, which again can also be searched by Ben 10, much like Diviner can. So yeah, for all these reasons and more, I'm going to be putting Drytron as the very first deck at the top of our tier 1.5 category. Next up, we have Eldlich, and it may be a bit weird to say this, or to see this even. I'm going to put Eldlich up in the meta-changing category. And this isn't for regular Trap Eldlich, even with 3-scale Drain, whatever, who really cares about that. This is about Pile Eldlich, aka you're taking Based, but you're also adding Cybers cards. It's also called Cybers Eldlich, not really Pile Eldlich. But you're basically taking 1-card combos with Cybers cards, like Dotscaper. Yeah, the card from, like, the second structure deck for Lynx. You're taking that and 1-card comboing into a DPE Scythe Lock, and you're also ending off on all the other based things, while also having Eldritch traps to back it up like Sanguine, Conquistador, and Haquero. I think this deck is an absolute monster, and it's been seeing the competitive success to actually boast that, due to being able to cover so many fronts with both the traps, the monsters, and a few spell effects and the things like Emergency Teleport, Forbidden Droplet, Forbidden Chalice, etc. And I think it's a force to be reckoned with in this current format. I can't really say too much on it because I haven't seen much gameplay outside of what I have seen in the little of, but in the little of that I have seen, I should say, and the statistics to back it up, I think this deck definitely deserves a spot next to Sword Soul in the meta-changing slot, and they're probably not too far off from each other, probably just like neck and neck. I was going to put it slightly under just for continuity's sake. Next up, we have Flunderies, and Flunderies, pleasantly enough, has been seeing a lot of really good success. Ever since it got Advent of Adventure in Battle of Chaos, it's been doing a lot better compared to what it did on release, seeing a bunch of tops here and there at the regionals, and becoming very, very close to actually winning some. Being able to play cards like Dimension Shifter is very, very powerful in this sort of format, because things being banished until you get like your own Arclight or something out is very painful, especially since it's from literally anywhere and it's any card. And of course, you don't care playing Flunderies about your own stuff getting banished. In fact, you want it to get banished, and so it's more of a helping card than it is a hindrance to you in the slightest. While it's not the most oppressive floodgate since it is very small, the barrier statue is still very strong, and things like Ryza being able to, quick effect just bounce stuff on your opponent's turn is really, really strong for the deck. You also have the powerful floodgate in the form of M-Pin, which admittedly only affects things in attack position, but that stops Hulk, it stops Auroradon, it stops all sorts of things like that. and so they're basically just gonna have to like power out a DPE in defense and try to pop your things while you're also just interrupting them with things like Barrier Statue. I think the deck is very, very good, especially right now, and I'm glad that it's actually seen competitive success after we've all hyped it up so much on Yu-Gi-Oh! YouTube, and so it's going to be going in the top of our tier 1.5 category. Speaking of penguins though, our next deck is Fluffle, which is a returning deck from the last few lists that we've had, and I'm going to be just slightly generous and put it at the top of Rogue, only because, according to Team Bortle, we just had a Lubbock Regional, which unfortunately I was not able to make it to, but Fluffle actually got top 4. Admittedly, it was called Pure Fluffle, but it was basically just DPE Turbo. We wasn't even playing Dog, but technically I guess it is Fluffle, you know, whatever, I guess. Even though he was playing like a lot of DPE package cards in the main, like, you know, Mally and Denier, but regardless, whatever, who cares. I think Fluffle's in a very good spot with Scythe still being around, and admittedly, while it can't do it as easy as other decks, Scythe locking is just completely native to this deck without even having to summon something like DPE or risk losing their pieces by even playing it because of the power card known as Headchimp Scythe. Being able to just summon a whale on your opponent's turn, pop a card on your field and your opponent's field, non-targeting by the way, much like DPE, and it is on summon, as well as being able to dodge something like a Droplet, or, well, it doesn't really dodge Droplet, but it dodges things like Dark Ruler, being able to summon itself whenever you really feel like it, as well as being able to protect itself by using the Headchimp Scythe in grave, so that it doesn't just die super easy, as well as giving you graveyard setup in the form of the Fright for Repair. Fluffle admittedly is a very high skill ceiling deck coming from someone that's played it for literally years. I played every sort of different version of this deck, and so it's not the easiest to pick up, especially the combo build instead of the Oonga Boonga beatdown build, which I prefer admittedly. It is a very strong deck, being able to end off on boards such as Appaloosa for a few negates, Cross Sheep instead, actually, if you want to go for that for more advantage. The Scythe Lock, of course, Toad, Abyss Dweller, sometimes all of these on the same board, and if you really feel cheeky, you can play DPE. However, basically everything in your extra deck is a DPE in its own right. And so I'm going to be putting Fluffle at the top of our Rogue category, just above Dinosaur, specifically because it actually does have statistics to back it up, especially with the new Guardian Chimera coming out in Battle of Chaos being really good for the deck in case you don't want to just summon Tiger, and hopefully it stays there for a little while longer until Scythe gets inevitably banned. Next up we have Orcust, and unlike a certain other Yugi tuber, I'm going to not call this deck absolute dog water, and I think Orcust is very, very neat. So the thing is with Orcust is we have to not think about it like a deck pure or anything like that. You know, like normal summon Gearsu the entire game or whatever, try to win like that and then brick on really bad hands. You have to think of it like an engine like it used to be. Of course, everybody knows the Scrap Orcust build being super consistent but a bit fragile and the end board being only okay. The very explosive PK build of Orcust, however, it is very clunky in terms of its hands. And of course, Pure Orcust, which has a mediocre end board, honestly, despite it being relatively consistent. But personally, I've been messing around with Chaos Lightsworn Orcust, and that may sound really strange, but you're basically going full Chaos Lightsworn combo, potentially even summoning a Christie if you feel like it, while also having the entire Orcust Babel setup engraved with things like Symbol Skeleton, Nightmare, and all sorts of things like that, and having Galatea and potentially even a Crescendo. I think the deck is super powerful, even if it is a bit, like, specific on what kind of a hand or RNG you need. However, being able to just mill over and over and get so much stonks off of just using the Lightsworn stuff, as well as having access to Fairy Tail Snow now off the last ban list, I think Orcust is in a better spot than it has been in a long time. People just really need to give the deck a chance and think of it less as a deck and more as an archetype to put in with other decks in order to make itself relevant again. So yeah, I am on a bit of copium here, but I think that Orcust is in a very good spot. Next up we have Sky Striker, and Sky Striker is in a better place than ever. I will put it above Drytron but below Flunder. Of course, Imperial Order finally disappearing has been very good for the deck, not to mention the fact that not only do they have DPE now, which outs itself, but we also have the Adventure token engine that outs itself as well. So now you're not only ending on full Striker stuff, because Ray doesn't need a normal summon, you're also ending off on a Griffin Rider that returns itself back to the deck, and you're ending off on a DPE that pops itself so you can still activate your Sky Striker cards. And so you're getting a pop, an Omni Negate, and then all of your things in your back row, being able to consistently just repeat your turn over and over, because of course that's what Eternal format decks did, and so you're left with an absolute monster of a deck. While I do hate to say it, Sky Striker is in such a good place right now, and it's only going to get better as we get more cards. Of course, being the Mr. Rune archetype, We're also getting Linkage, which I don't know when we're getting Linkage, but we are getting Linkage. And we have an unrevealed Sky Striker card. It's not really a Sky Striker card. It hasn't been confirmed if it is, but it says it supports Sky Strikers. We have that coming on its way eventually. I think it's a jump promo. And so I don't know who at Konami is so obsessed with calling Ray Bay, but they need to stop because this deck does not need any more help. It's not even going to be surprising if next ban list we get Engage to 2 or Multi-Roll to 2 or even Hornet Drones to 2, because this deck is just such a fan favorite at this point. And by fan, I mean Konami. Next up, we have Tri-Brigade, and it's so weird to say this, but Tri-Brigade hasn't been doing anything. So correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if there's any sort of tops at these last few regionals. If there was, it was probably in the 32 and not even 16. But the last time I saw Tri-Brigade do well at an event, it was a Side Deck Cafe regional with one top with Melfi Tri-Brigade. Ever since this last ban list, Tri-Brigade has just been completely swept under the rug compared to all the other decks, because it really just can't keep up with the base stuff in its pure form, and the Bird Up variant, as well as the things like the Zodiac variant and the Lunalight variant are just completely irrelevant at this point, even though I do love Bird Up. I think it actually did get a top 32 with the Lubbock one, but I don't really know, honestly. But it's really funny how this sort of proves that Tri-Brigade itself isn't really the problem, it's the archetypes it's with, because let's be real, Zodiac is a crime against humanity, and Lyrilusk did not have any right being as broken as it was, being a Lyrilusk player myself. And so you can blame Fractal for the BBW archetypes disappearing all you want, but let's be real, the Tri-Brigades were the most fair parts about those decks. So yeah, it's very, very strange seeing the very top dog not doing anything anymore. But yeah, it's going to be at the top of our tier 2 category. I will give it the benefit of the doubt there, even though I believe Invoked has seen a bit more success and will see more success. But, you know, I'm coping just a little bit, okay? I'm coping just a little bit. I love Tri-Brigade. But yeah, top of the tier 2 category, that's where it's going to go. Next up, we have Virtual World, and I'm going to be putting Virtual World at the very bottom of tier 1.5. I'm a bit coping here as well, but we did recently just get 3 emergency teleport as well as the adventure package, so the deck is thriving more than ever has, even with the loss of 2 desires or 1 desire if we're playing the right ratio. So while it did lose consistency in that regard, it has gained consistency in the form of the emergency teleports, which is really, really good. I personally think a Punk build is actually really solid for the deck, as it helps you synchro and Xyz climb a lot off of just the emergency teleports, while also getting you more advantage from just your virtual worlds, while not having to rely completely on getting the virtual worlds in your hand. And of course, you can also play the adventure token engine, which is really good at getting an Omni Negate to protect from things such as Nib, which the deck really does not like. So while its greatest enemy is itself, we are sort of in a better format for a virtual world compared to the last few ones, and so I think the deck is in a very good spot with all the different variations you can play of the deck. Next up, we have Prank-Kids, and Prank-Kids is going to be another meta-changing deck. Prank-Kids is really good right now. The main reason it fell off after the hit to the Meow Meow Moo is the fact that getting hand-trapped after going into your 1 Meow Meow was a very big problem, because while you did have access to your 1-card combos, a single hand-trap can completely shut down your turn, and without the second Meow Meow to try and do it next turn if you don't get OTK'd, there's really not much you can do. However, with the introduction of Adventurer Token, have you noticed a theme lately between DPE and Adventurer Token? You're able to protect yourself from hand traps, admittedly not completely, but you can usually play through at least one even after utilizing your Griffin Rider negate because of all the extra stuff, while still being able to play 1-card combos and a bunch of hand traps to fill up the empty void of space. They also have access to 3 Skill Drain if they so choose, because Skill Drain is very solid in a deck where, yeah, everything tributes for cost or activates Engrave, so have fun, duelists. I did like Prank-Kids at first, but then I got sick of it, so I'm kinda upset that it's back in the top slots again. I think it needs to go back down to tier 2 where it's rightfully deserving, but with Adventure at full strength and with the 1-card combos being so explosive, I don't think it's going to be going anywhere from the top slots anytime soon. Next up is Earth Machine. Moving on, of course. Next up we have Phantom Knight, and guys, Phantom Knight isn't doing so hot. So I know it was a bit of hyping in my last few tier lists and some other YouTubers' last few tier lists, but Phantom Knight has been very heavily underperforming. Admittedly, I will put it above Virtual World and Drytron, even though I don't even know if it's been doing better than those, because I am sort of kind of like giving the benefit of the doubt to the deck. But the deck ended up being a lot less viable than a lot of people ended up thinking, mainly because it can't go second. So of course, with the other really fast decks going around like Based, you're going to be setting up a bunch of negates and having a bunch of hand traps in hand, and while you do have a lot of extenders, that's not really enough extenders for all the sort of interruptions that the deck has. Their only going second play really is hard opening the droplet if they main it, and so they're going to have a really bad time actually trying to break a board if they're forced to go second, and they're not too great off going first if they don't draw the adventure token engine, or if the opponent draws multiple hand traps, and considering how many hand traps we're playing this format, it's really going to be hard for the deck to thrive in a situation like this. The end board of DPE, Scythe Lock, and then a couple of Fog Blades and maybe another Pop is really like the worst version of Pile or Base you could play in terms of the end board, and so there's really no reason to play this deck over any sort of the other ones unless it's in terms of price point, but let's be real, you're already paying money on the adventure token package anyway, so you probably have more money to spend on something else. So yeah, PK was on the Copium train for the longest time, but I don't think it's doing very great at all right now, and so I'm going to have to put it in around the center of tier 1.5. Next up we have Adamancipator, and I will be putting this above Orcust in the tier 2 category. Again, I am coping very hard for Adamancipator. I really like the deck, and I think it's in a very good spot. Admittedly, it's probably one of the worst ways you can do DPE Scythe Lock, but that is an option for the deck, so keep that in mind, and it is a bit RNG focused. However, its end boards can be super explosive if it manages to go off, especially with built-in nib protection without the adventure stuff if you really choose it, because of things like Kawaki Myru Guardian. While not the best combo deck, it is very good at being a freeform combo deck, so it's very good at practicing your combos, especially if you want to do a non-linear combo, to avoid, things like mid-range decks. And so I think it's a very good deck for, newer combo players to pick up if they're sick of the same old, though admittedly, it is not the best in terms of what it can do compared to all the other decks this format. The power disparity between Adamancipator and something like, even Cyrus, Eldlich, or Sword Soul is very, very big, and so while I don't think it's going to be snagging any events here anytime soon, I think it might be able to top here and there and see relative success depending on the pilot. Next up we have Dragon Link, and I'm going to put Dragon Link just above Prank-Kids, honestly, because Dragon Link has been doing exceptionally well, which I find a bit interesting. However, I can actually see why this is, and that's because we are no longer in a board-breaking meta, therefore, being able to play through hand traps like Dragon Link can, especially with access to the adventure token engine, the deck is very good in a format such as this, because while it doesn't really have any sort of follow-up from getting its board broken, it can play through getting hand trapped really, really well and set up the board even through all of them. Again, it does have access to things like the Brave token engine and things like Baronet, which is really solid for the deck, even after losing something like LP a couple of ban lists ago, and this deck honestly just refuses to die. Until we get into another format in which board breakers are better, because this deck has basically no follow-up whatsoever, it's going to thrive in a hand trap heavy format, and be able to dominate a lot of the top tables depending on what it can do in its end board, because now it can have access to the Rose Dragon package, which I totally forgot to mention earlier. That was one of the ones I was forgetting, but due to the Rose Dragons and the adventure tokens and yada yada, all sorts of things like that, it is doing better than it has in the last few months for sure. Next up we have Cyber Dragon, and Cyber Dragon, while I do love the deck, is not in a very good spot right now at all. I will put it above Earth Machine because it fucks over Earth Machine, but poor Cyber Dragon is still in such a very bad format, because yeah, you can make big punchy all you want, but try doing that through a bunch of negates and pops and all sorts of disruptions, and baby, you're not going to go far with Cyber Dragon. Please just promise me that. They do eventually have the new card coming that searches Overload Fusion, which I think is very good for the deck, especially in case they do ban something like Verte, which the deck really thrived on. But until that day, it's just not in a very great spot at all. Next up, we have Salamangreat, and I will be generous and put it above Adamancipator, but below Despia. I think Salamangreat is perfectly fine, especially after the last ban list, freeing, especially after the semi-limiting of Salamangreat Circle in the last Forbidden Limited list. It's been doing a lot better. Admittedly, though, the deck really can't play through too many hand traps if its hand isn't that great, and the bigger thing is that its end board is super lackluster. Admittedly, you can get away with playing the Adventure Token engine in the deck, but at that point, if you're buying the Adventure Token engine, I wouldn't really recommend playing it in something like Salamangreat. Just go ahead and pick up something else like Virtual World, because I believe Virtual World's probably even cheaper. Salamangreat had its fun in the sun, but for now, it really just remains a gimmicky access code .deck, or even transcode update jammer .deck that has really good follow-up due to being able to do its turns over and over again. Next up, we got the bees, and the bees have not been doing very well. I'll be nice and put them above Madolche, especially because they did get access to Dragonbite a few sets ago, meaning that they have better access to synchro plays should they choose, especially things like Baronet, which is very powerful, or even Savage Dragon. However, Bee Trooper just has not been seeing the statistics since that one YCS that I believe it was that it got second place at, because let's be real, the end board for the deck is very lackluster. If we got more good stuff, generic extra deck insect things, I believe it would be definitely a lot better, or even good main deck stuff to end off on. But until then, sitting on a really big monster or maybe like one disruption is not the greatest. Finally, we have Live Twitch, which I'm coping so hard that this deck is good, but let's be real, it's really not. Until the Labyrinth stuff comes out, which you can splash with the deck really easily, and I think is really fun and really good, it just hasn't been seeing any sort of success. I will be putting it just above Cyber Dragon, but I'll put it below Adagnister, as it just overall has not been doing any sort of tournament success outside of fun little side tournaments. But with that out of the way, and 45 minutes later, we have finished our tier list for the competitive April 2022 Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. Please feel free to look at this screenshot and post it in your group chats and make fun of me to your friends, I don't mind. And feel free to click away in the comments about being salty that I put something in the wrong spot, or say that I'm coping too hard about something, because let's be real, we're all gonna wait for the person that skips to the end and just types away without a care in the world. But yeah, while I'm not the best at these sort of tier lists, I do think this is relatively accurate, at least in terms of the top decks, because I believe these first probably 7 are very, very accurate in terms of the top decks. I will say that I'm probably being a bit too hasty in terms of putting Despia in the tier 2 category, sort of in the middle. But I just don't think it's going to be as great over here as it was in the OCG by a landslide. Maybe as an engine with the branded stuff in terms of some other decks, like I said, with Invoked. Maybe even in base, people might play it. Especially with things like Super Poly, but I think that Despia overall just is not really worth it, especially with $80 loopers, bro. Like, you're just asking to get robbed at that point. But yeah, that's going to be my tier list. I really hope you did all enjoy, because that's going to have to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like on it. It helps put this video and the channel into YouTube recommended. And if you really liked it and you want to see more content like this, like the rest of my tier list and my upcoming Sleeper Sunday on Mutant that I will have coming up, because that is with the winner of the poll, then feel free to subscribe, because we are on the climb, baby. We're going to try to get to 1,500 by the time I graduate. That would be awesome. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.